Situation is completely without precedent. It's absolutely unique. I don't think I can think of any previous example where a host of the World Cup has attacked a country that is supposed to participate in that World Cup 4 months out from the tournament. We're in completely uncharted territory.
Well, it all seemed too good to be true, really. Other than the automatic hosts, Iran were the third country to qualify for the 2026 World Cup. They topped their group in Asia and flew through qualification. And then in another fortuitous episode, Iran were drawn in what I think and is statistically one of the easiest groups. They're with Belgium, probably one of the least good pot one teams at this stage, along with Egypt and New Zealand. And then again, fortuitously, they were drawn into a group that plays primarily on the West Coast, and Iran were due to play 2 games in LA, including against Belgium. And that's special because Los Angeles has the greatest enclave of Iranians outside of Iran. There are so many Iranian-Americans in LA that it's sometimes referred to as Tehrangeles. So this was a huge thing for the Iranian-American community. And then, of course, as we know, on February 28th, the US and Israel struck Iran. Since then, there have been further mass strikes, the loss of hundreds of civilian lives, including young girls in a school. There have been retaliatory strikes. The Gulf states are kind of locked down. This really throws into jeopardy Iran's participation in the World Cup. From what I'm hearing, this is really uncharted territory. The last time a qualified nation pulled out of a World Cup was in 1950, and that was not because of political reasons. So this really is unprecedented. Last week, when Donald Trump was asked if Iran plays, he said, quote, "I really don't care." It also raises whether Donald Trump can decide whether a country participates in the World Cup. Again, we have no precedents for this. But if he decides 2 days before the tournament starts that he doesn't want Iran, I don't see a way out of that. What happens now or next month or the month after that? Does Iran pull out off their own accord? If they do, who replaces them? If they pick another team from the Asian Confederation, it's likely to be Iraq or the United Arab Emirates, which are 2 teams that almost qualified. That gets pretty complicated. But to drill down on this a little bit more, I spoke to Christian Coates Ulrichsen, who is a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston. He's also a fellow Brit and a big soccer fan, and he's just written a book called Kingdom of Football, which is about Saudi Arabia's recent massive investment in global football. So with that, I will take you to our chat. Christian, thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Christian, I really wanted to get a sense from you with the context of strikes on Iran and retaliation, what that might mean for Iran's participation in the World Cup. I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your work generally. Do you mind just introducing yourself and your work and connection to soccer a little bit as well?
Yeah, thank you. I've been reading, writing, analyzing the Gulf states for 20 years now. I work on the politics, political economy, international relations of the Gulf states, on US Gulf relations, on the security dynamics between the Gulf states and Iran, and the rise of the Gulf states as major actors on the global stage, and so especially Qatar, UAE. I've worked on Saudi Arabia, and I guess my segue into soccer is that I just wrote a book about Saudi Arabia and how and why they invested so heavily in soccer over the past 5, 6 years, beginning with the acquisition of Cristiano Ronaldo in 2022, then all the other major stars who went to the Saudi Pro League in 2023, the PIF, Public Investment Fund, acquiring Newcastle in the Premier League in 2021, and taking majority stakes in 4 top Saudi teams in, again, 2023. And then, of course, the announcement in December 2024 that Saudi Arabia would be named host of the 2034 World Cup. So I began to, being a massive football fan myself, I began to notice over the past decade and more, not overnight, but over time, that the Gulf states are becoming increasingly visible in the world of soccer and in sport more generally. as investors, as sponsors. Think of going to the Etihad, going to the Emirates, Manchester or in London. It's part of now the language of football as participants and obviously as hosts.
Yeah, great. And can I hear that you're also a Brit?
And my father's Norwegian, but my mother's English. And so obviously both Norway and England are soccer crazy, although again in Norway there's been maybe much more of a pushback against what they would talk about as sports washing. And so we haven't seen a necessarily the sort of embrace of some of the Gulf money like we have in, say, Manchester, or for Manchester City at least, or for Newcastle.
Yeah. Well, it'll be exciting to see Haaland at least this summer.
Yes, well, Norway qualified in '94, and his father played in that team. It was the last time I was in the US, and so maybe having World Cups in the US is a good sign for Norway.
Maybe, yeah. You talked a little bit about Saudi and the Gulf states. Iran's obviously a different story. I mean, do you have a sense of what soccer means to Iran and Iranians and Iranian Americans?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, it's huge. It's massive. I mean, Iranians are as passionate soccer fans as anyone else in the world. Iran was actually the first country from the Middle East to qualify for the World Cup back in 1978, and they drew with Scotland, one of many results that the Scottish have maybe not preferred to remember. And I mean, 20 years later, for example, they played Australia to qualify, and they had 120,000 people in the stadium when they qualified. And there was a similar situation in 2002 where they played the Irish and didn't qualify in that instance. So there's a massive, massive interest in the game. You'll remember the 1998 World Cup when Iran beat the US 2-1.
Yeah.
That was seen, I think, very through a very political lens, but it sparked celebrations across the country. Even the Supreme Leader, now the late Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, got involved and sort of started, congratulating the team and linking it to the triumph, sort of Iranian resilience over the US. And so it's huge. A diaspora as well. Obviously, places like Los Angeles in the US, soccer hotbeds as well. So for Iran to be playing in the World Cup has always been a big thing, albeit, of course, that we are now in a pretty unique situation in the World Cup that's about to take place.
Iran was supposed to play two games, still scheduled to play two games in LA, I think one in Seattle. So
Yeah.
really big deal for the diaspora, like you say. How are current events, like we said, the strikes on Iran and the retaliation now, are those fundamentally changing the prospect of Iran participating in the World Cup?
Situation is completely without precedent. It's absolutely unique. I don't think I can think of any previous example where a host of the World Cup has attacked a country that is supposed to participate in that World Cup 4 months out from the tournament. I think we're in completely uncharted territory. The closest I can think of was in 1982 when the Falklands War actually ended, I think, during the World Cup in Spain. But of course, that involved two teams taking part, England and Argentina, and they fortuitously didn't have to play each other. That was 4 years later in Mexico with the hand of God. And the World Cup wasn't being hosted by one or the other. It was in Spain. Now, had it been 4 years before in 1978, it would have been a different issue. So we've never had a situation where the host and a participant are technically at war with each other, or whatever you would define this military operation as. Iran is already on a complete travel ban, which meant that Iranian supporters would not be able to enter the US. There were three other countries on that travel ban, Senegal, Haiti, and the Ivory Coast, which is also highly problematic from a FIFA perspective of trying to ensure access to all supporters from all countries. There were many other countries on a lesser travel ban, which doesn't apply for tourist visas for the World Cup, but those include countries like Brazil, for example. Can you imagine a World Cup without Brazilians? So there were already a lot of issues that FIFA were encountering with the US co-hosting in this case, which might explain also why Gianni Infantino felt it was so important to get so close to Donald Trump, although that doesn't seem to have yet produced any real results. The last time I think a team withdrew was in 1950, so not really within living memory. And that was for logistical reasons. The tournament was in South America and it was just too far to go. It was in Brazil, post-war, especially when conditions were still recovering from wartime. We have no precedent. I mean, will the Iranian team feel safe? Will they be allowed in? Will there still be a conflict by June? Could it have escalated to the point where it's even worse than it is today? There are so many unknowns. The problem is that we are getting close to the World Cup. If Iran withdraws, another team needs to be selected. Now we have the playoffs coming up. Could it be a losing team from the playoffs? I guess the only example historically would be actually from the European Championships in 1992 when Yugoslavia was excluded literally 2 weeks before the tournament because of sanctions. And of course, the Danish team not only stepped in, but then won the tournament. So that is the only recent example of any I can think of in any aspect of the game. But there's a lot for FIFA to have to think about over the next few weeks.
Who is the decision maker here? Over the past couple of days, we've seen, I think it was the president of Iran's Football Federation say, quote, "We cannot be expected to look forward to the World Cup with hope." So pretty non-committal, but expressing some doubt. Trump said, "I really don't care if Iran participates." I mean, who's this up to? Is it up to FIFA? Is it up? I mean, could Trump say no to Iran? I mean, who's this up to?
I mean, in normal circumstances, FIFA really runs the show in the sense that FIFA gets the host country and all host cities to sign incredibly detailed documents that specify and stipulate exactly what the host cities need to do to conform to FIFA standards for hosting. And that's been the case up until the last World Cup. I think the difficulty now is that those documents don't necessarily sway the US government, and the US government is more powerful than most governments. In most states, FIFA can call the shots, and I think in this case, they're realizing they can't. And we're also seeing how in the US you have this unique, specific dynamics of games taking place in different states with different state laws as well. And we're seeing some of the dynamic there between federal and state funding, federal and state law, different powers. And we've seen all the cancellation of some of the fan zones over the past few weeks as well, how different municipal, state, and federal pathways are clashing. So it's really unclear at the moment what's going to happen. Trump saying, "I don't care," is obviously something that goes against the whole FIFA pledge of ensuring access to everyone. And back in 2018, when in the first Trump administration, when the US bid with Canada and Mexico, I think they did have to effectively promise within, of course, the bounds of national security. But they made a pledge that access would be guaranteed. Of course, from a FIFA point of view, I think there was an assumption that were Donald Trump to win a second term, it would be a consecutive second term in 2021, and that he would be out of office by this point. And I don't think there was necessarily a scenario that Trump was still in office and that this sort of disruption would actually be not just happening again, but at a much greater level than during his first term.
Obviously, I mean, FIFA and Trump have very different desires here, and it's hard to grasp what Trump wants from the World Cup, right? Because in one sense, he cares what the world thinks of him and probably wants to look good on the world stage, but at the same time, clearly, it looks like his political priorities are more important. So, has FIFA been duped into thinking that Trump is anti-war and wants to pave a really smooth way for FIFA to do what it wants to do? I suppose, what's the nature of the battling forces here?
Well, they did give Donald Trump the FIFA Peace
Yeah.
Prize, of course. So they clearly felt he had some peacemaking credibility, which again just puts Infantino in even more of a desperate light at the moment. I mean, not just now, but Venezuela as well. Kidnapping foreign leaders and now assassinating foreign leaders is not a recipe for peace in many people's minds. The real difficulty for FIFA is that they don't necessarily have any insight into what President Trump is going to do next, and there's no way of knowing. It's so unpredictable. The other big challenge I think that they face is that Donald Trump is so performative. For him, how something looks on television is so important. Having said that, there will likely be sold out stadiums for many of the games just by selling tickets to US fans alone. And so, I mean, if Donald Trump can get a World Cup with minimal international participants coming into the US, but still have stadiums more or less sold out, maybe not for some of the smaller games, he doesn't necessarily mind, I think. It's not going to be a big issue for inclusivity or access. And ironically, given all the criticism of Qatar in 2022, that was the most accessible World Cup for the global South. It was cheap, relatively cheap, especially compared to this World Cup. People were guaranteed a visa with their ticket. You had huge numbers traveling from across Asia and Africa, South America, obviously. And it was a World Cup that was far more accessible. But I don't think that Trump necessarily is minded by that. As long as there are stadiums that are more or less sold out, even if they're just American or US based audiences, it won't matter to him. And of course, we saw the Club World Cup last summer how that's a gamble because in some of the early games, there were huge banks of empty seats. But then we also saw how when Trump went to the final and then, of course, famously gate crashed the trophy celebration, and Chelsea must have thought they'd signed a new right winger. It showed that he is desperate to be part of it. From all we can hear, Trump is enthused about the World Cup. So Trump has a lot of interest in this going well. He just doesn't necessarily mind if the rest of the world doesn't take part in at least traveling to and enjoying the events with him.
You did mention the visa ban on Iran and some other countries. There was some hope, I think, in the past few months that those might be lifted temporarily to allow travel for at least players and coaches and families. Does this kind of just make that impossible? Even if Iran were to participate, do you foresee any issues at the border?
Yeah, the ban had been worded such that the players and their immediate entourage would be allowed in. Having said that, there were reports of officials with the Iranian Football Association being denied visas to attend the World Cup draw back in December. So, how tight do you draw that net? Is it just the team, the coaches, the medical staff, and that's it? Or do you allow immediate family members of the team? It was never clear, I think. This, of course, new situation that we're in makes it even less likely, perhaps, that some of the restrictions that were in place will be lifted. And so I think that's why we're in such uncharted territory. I mean, would the team even want to go to the US and play in the US? I had thought initially that one solution might be to have them play games in Canada or Mexico. You may recall back in 1990, the World Cup, England was parked on Sardinia because it was felt that they had to keep the English fans who were seen as hooligans away from the mainland. So they put them all on Sardinia where they could be better controlled. Now, the problem then was, of course, England went to the semi-finals and they had to play on the mainland from the second round onwards. But I had thought that something similar might happen this time where Iran played in Canada or Mexico, but that hasn't happened. As you say, they're supposed to play on the West Coast on the three games, Seattle and Los Angeles. And so will the team want to come? Will they be allowed in? If so, just the team, the coach, the entourage? It's really, really unclear. And FIFA's got to get some clarity on this pretty quickly.
What are the implications for security? I mean, is there concern that Iran could try and use proxies for attacks in the US? And I assume if so, what the World Cup is kind of a sitting duck for something like that.
I mean, World Cups are always sitting ducks, and I think in 1998 there were reports of Al Qaeda trying to disrupt the World Cup in France. And I think it was the 2010 World Cup final. There was a mass casualty bombing in, I think it was Nigeria by Boko Haram, of people watching the final. So actually, I mean, it's not just the World Cup itself, which is sitting duck, but people gathering to watch the World Cup. And that could be anywhere in the Middle East. It could be in Europe. It could be anywhere around the world. So anywhere where there are large numbers of people together could be a security risk. And if the situation with Iran and the US and Israel continues to spiral out of control, I mean, there could certainly be a lot of radical groups that would try to capitalize on this. So, that absolutely, I think there's a new security risk now that even a week ago wasn't as pronounced or as potential a danger.
We've already seen that host cities are struggling with funding for security and logistics and things like that. If Iran were to continue to participate, does that just essentially mean they need even more funding for security?
Well, it certainly means that the Department of Homeland Security, which has been shut down now for almost 3 weeks in the US as a result of clashes over the Minnesota ICE tactics, and DHS now has been closed for the better part of 3 weeks, which has been attributed to some delays in providing funding to host cities. That makes it even more imperative to try and figure out some of the issues around that as well. Because absolutely, if security costs increase, and if especially if they increase exponentially in the cities where Iran is supposed to play, but also in terms of any other public gathering, they'll increase pretty sharply potentially. So they will probably need more money. And the nature of the US system, municipal, state, and federal, is that the three levels don't always communicate with each other in the best way or have the same objectives. And we've seen some of those state and municipal tensions playing out over the last few weeks with the fan zones. So this could be an even greater level of uncertainty.
You know, you mentioned that we've seen the US and Iran play before. I think a couple of times they've been drawn in the same groups. Not this
Last time
time.
in 22,
Last time, yeah,
with England
with
as well,
England and Wales, yeah.
and Wales too.
This year, obviously they haven't been drawn together. But say, you know, in the later stages of the tournament, US and Iran are due to play on home soil. I mean, what does that look
Yes.
like?
Well, yes, that would be the ultimate grudge match. I think that would be even greater than England-Argentina in 1986, which for the Argentines was some sort of divine retribution for the Falklands, and especially the way Maradona scored his hand of God goal was seen as getting one back on the English, and then the famous goal was seen as just reinforcing that superiority. So I mean that would be maybe comparable to this one, albeit that I mean the level of animosity and tension would be enormous. I mean, if you remember back in '98 when they played in France, the Iranian team came out with flowers for the US team with roses. I mean, there was a gesture of reconciliation, and that was at a time of political hope that there could be a rapprochement. And the Iranian leadership under Khatami had reached out to the Clinton administration. But this would be absolutely opposite. There'd be political tension. The players would be completely fired up on both sides. The fans, obviously, there probably wouldn't be any Iranian fans. If there were American Iranians or Americans of Iranian origin, if the team was still representing the Islamic Republic of Iran, we've seen how the diaspora, in some cases, has been quite anti-regime. So it would be interesting to see where their loyalties would lie as well.
Could you tell me a little bit more about how the diaspora feels about these attacks on Iran and the regime? It's obviously very complex, and I'm hearing different things from different people. Say the diaspora in LA. I mean, how are they feeling about this?
But like you say, it's so complicated and complex, and I mean, there are many in the diaspora who are in the US for a reason. They had to leave Iran. They had to flee, or their parents had to leave after 1979. So there's no inherent love for the Islamic Republic. That's also why they've had to leave. But then they also don't always coalesce around what should happen next. I mean, there's a group that obviously supports the return of the last Shah's son, but then there are others who don't. And so there's never, I think, been a unified view politically about what should happen next. And so I think some of these divisions could come close to the surface now, especially that it seems that the Islamic Republic, is tottering. So maybe some of those discussions, which were more theoretical in the past, have now become a lot more real. But of course, then you also expose some of the divisions and lack of consensus, perhaps, except that many people, I think, in the diaspora will be happy to see the Islamic Republic, the theocracy, out of power, but not necessarily thinking about what might happen next.
Either way, though, if Iran were not to participate, I mean, that would be a pretty monumental loss, right, to Iranian Americans, Persian Americans. The World Cup qualification is a long process, and you know, it's only every 4 years, and it's a bit unfair, right, in a way, to not be allowed to participate after all that.
Well, it would be. And I mean, of course, in a normal circumstance, I think a lot of people would have wanted to have seen the team in the US, even if they didn't necessarily love the regime that was behind it. But people can separate the regime from a national football team. But obviously, in these circumstances, it's even more difficult. I mean, the Iranian women's team is playing in the Women's Asian Cup at the moment. It's, I think, in Australia. In their first game early this week, they were silent when the national anthem was sung. And I don't know if they made a statement. I'm not sure if they did. Could have been if they didn't want to sing an anthem that was obviously a Islamic Republic anthem. But they may also have felt that in this moment of pain and this moment of trauma for Iran, there was singing was inappropriate. So it's hard to read some of the gestures, but yes, absolutely. In terms of, I mean, you go through a qualifying campaign that is more than a year and a half long, and you deserve to be there by right. And so, if they were excluded for non-sporting reasons, it would be pretty unique from a FIFA perspective.
The finalissima between Spain and Argentina was due to take place is due to take place, I think, in Qatar, but that's being reassessed. What's the situation in the Gulf region right now? I mean, would it be safe to have a game like that in a few weeks' time?
But I think the more practical issue is that the airspace is more or less currently closed, and flights in and out are almost completely disrupted, apart from flights taking people out if they're stranded or bringing nationals back home. So, I mean, nobody's really thinking about bringing people for major events. And I think the nature of the threat in the Gulf is most people aren't going to be struck by a missile or a drone. I mean, there have been some deaths and dozens of injuries reported, and of course, 6 US service members died in Kuwait. There's a minimal risk of being struck, but the problem is that it could happen at any point at any time. There's that sort of generic risk. Now, there have been fewer missile attacks over the last few days, which could indicate that either Iran is running out of stocks or that US and Israeli airstrikes against launch sites have been effective. The problem is it's the drones. Iran has about, I mean, there have been reportedly stocks of tens of thousands of drones which could be launched at any point, and they're the ones that could do damage. And all it takes is one drone to hit a packed out stadium to cause a mass casualty event. We haven't yet had one of those, thankfully. So it's too risky, I think, now to play games in the region until we have greater clarity about how the conflict either winds down or sort of settles into some sort of pattern. But right now, given that the pattern is the Gulf states are being attacked on a daily basis, it's hard to imagine. And again, the fact that the Finalissimo was going to take place in Qatar, which has also hosted in the past couple of years the game between the current champions of each continent, shows that the Gulf states have inserted themselves so heavily in the sporting landscape that they're hosting events almost every week. There's something. I mean, there's going to be the Bahrain Grand Prix and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in a month or so. And that's clearly going to have to be potentially reassessed. We have the EuroLeague in basketball, which has two Israeli teams, and now this year a Dubai team. Would they have a game where thousands of people would be in a stadium, potentially at risk? If you can't travel into and out of Dubai, that's an issue. I mean, thinking longer term, Saudi Arabia has the Asian Cup next year. Qatar will host the Basketball World Championships in 2027. There's obviously going to be another round of Grand Prix in the autumn in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi. So a whole range of sporting events and many others, I think, will be either disrupted or at least uncertain for the moment.
And ultimately, as you've written about the World Cup in 8 years' time.
Yes, yes, of course, long-term speaking. And one reason why the Saudis have been so keen to avoid conflict is that they really want to focus laser-like on domestic economic development, connected with Vision 2030, which Mohammed bin Salman launched in 2016. Back then, 2030 seemed a long way away. It's now less than 4 years away. He doesn't want anything to derail all the projects that are part of Vision 2030. A big element of Vision 2030 is tourism. The Saudis want tourism to be 10% of GDP by 2030. They want 150 million visits a year. Well, people won't want to visit the region if it's a war zone, even if they can get a flight into the region as well. And then longer term, the World Cup has become obviously so huge. I mean, at some point, they're going to have to start building 11 new stadiums. And again, bringing construction material in, workers in, specialists in, all that could be at risk from a prolonged conflict.
Well, yeah, grim prospects all around it looks like. But Christian, I really appreciate you taking the time. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, we had last year the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, and that lasted 12 days by definition. If we get to mid-March, where this has been going on for 2 weeks or more, a lot of people's risk assessments will start to change quite dramatically. Right now, I think there's still a hope that many people hold that we'll have a few days of intense action and then something will give. The US will decide that mission accomplished, to use a phrase from 2003, when it actually wasn't accomplished, or the regime in Iran will fold, or there'll be back channels for a ceasefire. If by mid-March we're still in the situation of uncontrolled escalation on both sides, then risk assessments will really be changing. And that, of course, will include a lot of the sporting events as well that take place in the Gulf on a yearly basis, but also, especially at this time of year, between November and April, in the cooler weather, that's when majority of them actually do take place. And so there's a lot that will be up in the air over the next few weeks.
We'll keep an eye and see what happens. This has been really informative. I really appreciate it.